So, I would like to share some philosophical thoughts on social isolation in consideration of the tree. As someone who lives alone and is well adapted to living and working independently, I found myself reflecting on COVID isolation imposed as opposed to alone by choice, and what it has meant to me personally and professionally. So, given all of my aloneness skills, I was astonished at the effect isolation imposed had on my psyche. I felt an aloneness that I was not used to experiencing. I missed having human contact, the usual and heartfelt warm smile and big hug from friends were now socially distanced relationships. Meetings with colleagues were replaced with Zoom meetings that offered little in the way of camaraderie or the tangible nature of sharing ideas and experiencing. Personal introspection led to many thoughts, not only of humanity's interdependence, but of our dependence on other species with which we coexist, seen and unseen, and often hiding in plain sight. What have we all learned from this pandemic experience? Did we feel the stress that forced isolation imposes? Feelings of sadness, depression, deprivation, an inability to cope, an inability to escape ourselves, a loss of solidarity with one's own kind? Did we analyze our capacity to tolerate these stresses? And what did we learn? Have we been introspective about who we are and what we need and why? Thinking more broadly, has the urbanite pandemic experience broadened our awareness of that many species community in which we live? Has the reality of forced isolation and its dynamic left us a bit more aware of the fact that we do not live in a species specific void, but rather just how connected and interconnected we all are with everything else that tries, often desperately, to coexist with us? Given that we are intricately woven into and dependent on the fabric of that relationship web, what must we contribute to support those relationships and maintain that web that provides us with life's essentials? In order to really explore these philosophical questions on the nature of relationships, I would like to introduce you to another highly sophisticated social organism whose existence we have had a millennia-long dependence on, specifically the tree and the urban landscapes we have asked it to populate. Trees have been an essential ingredient in our lives since Homo sapiens first appeared on the earth. And so, it's not surprising that during COVID lockdown, there were more people visiting forests within and around cities. The call of the forest as nurturer is an excellent starting point for our observations and considerations. Almost all the trees we plant in our urban centers originate in a forest somewhere in the world. Given that urban forestry has evolved with our need to put nature back in places where nature's presence has been eliminated, it is critical that we establish a better understanding of the urban tree and its origins. What is its forest persona? What is a forest ecosystem? And how does that drive the genetics that these trees bring to an urban ecosystem? How does that forest tree grow and manage itself, recognizing that you can take the tree out of the forest, but you can never take the forest out of the tree? Tree growth, be it in the forest or the streets of a city, is the combined interaction of genetic potential, its capacity, what it can do, and its ability to deliver on that capacity, driven by surrounding environmental conditions, how it is enabled and thus able to do. So let's take our COVID isolation imposed to the forest to explore the nature of relationships and the relationships in nature. A forest ecosystem is a complex, adaptive ecosystem, a sophisticated, highly developed community of trees and all their associates, related flora, fauna, and, most importantly, soil, with a profile consisting of an organic layer and horizons A, topsoil, B, subsoil, and C, parent material, supporting a mycorrhizal network and containing a functioning soil microbial community, providing air, water, and the nutrients, macro and micro, all associates in the forest community depend on, either directly or indirectly. Forests are a process of evolution. They don't happen in a day, a week, or a year. They occur over millennia, beginning with the specific soils they populate and in direct relationship to their environment, temperature range, the soil's texture, structure, and pH, and the availability of light and water will all dictate what species are growing and where. For example, edge or interior, or lower elevation or higher. Although a forest may consist of many different species of trees, space above ground is shared in competition, while space below ground is shared in community. Trees are social. They are collaborators. They have evolved to depend on a communal rooting landscape, a symbiotic mycorrhizal network providing intra and interspecies communication that enhances self-management mechanisms such as the sharing of nutrients and early warning for defense purposes. Individual forestry architecture is reiterative and dynamic, responding to interspatial relationships and prevailing environmental conditions such as access to space and light. Trees grow with their root crown, their buttress roots, above the soil line, as do all parts of the tree that are covered with bark. Bark, in its entirety, requires air and light in order to function properly and should never be subjected to the constant moisture of soil or mulch. An individual forest tree's root system begins at the trunk-root transition zone, its root crown, with the development of at least 4 first-order roots in each of the 4 cardinal directions. The extension of these large, woody first-order roots, forming the root system's perennial framework, is primarily responsible for structural support, transport, and storage. They branch out horizontally into the surrounding soil, the zone of rapid taper, decreasing their diameter as they grow into the fine, non-woody part of the root system. Along with their symbiotic mycorrhizal fungi, they are responsible for the uptake of water and nutrients. Growth is opportunistic. Root exploration of the underground landscape depends on the presence of oxygen, water, nutrient availability, and a soil temperature that accommodates growth. Almost all the extension activity occurs within the top meter of soil, with fibrous roots in the uppermost portion of this range, extending a minimum of 2.5 to 3 times the width of the crown, depending species and environment. Forest soil is always covered by related flora, leaf litter, or other organic forest detritus, a constant recycling and renewing of organic resources, a healthy and diverse soil ecosystem, the teeming life contained within forest soils is the foundation for forest health and forest diversity. Reviewing these criteria, one can see why our urban trees are not thriving. We have asked our trees to work their ecosystem services magic, but we have deprived them of their essential forest ecosystem needs. We want our trees to do for us according to our needs and designs, but we have ignored how they have evolved and what they require in order to satisfy our needs. While a tree's vigor is related to its genetics, its vitality is environmental. How successfully can that forest tree grow and thrive given the existing environmental urban conditions in which it finds itself? While our urban trees are being planted into an ecosystem, it's an urban ecosystem, and the ecosystem of their origin and the community that these trees evolved with and adapted to is nowhere to be found. The tree that evolved in a complex community is now asked to exist as an isolated entity, divorced from its communal associates, its family, its traditional connective tissue. Instead of providing some of its needs, some of its preferences, we have consistently asked it to exist an isolated, stressed, corona life. COVID has demonstrated the power of our collective will when we can agree on what is important and beneficial. Can we collectively use our own imposed isolation experience, what we each endured during those many, many months, to enhance our professional consideration of the tree? The knowledge that you can take the tree out of the forest, but you can never take the forest out of the tree, must inform our understanding of how trees' genetic capacity dictates their communal needs, and how accommodation of those communal needs can enable the what that our urban trees were meant to be. What is needed is a critical implementing of tree reality and how we practice urban forestry, enabling trees' communal connections rather than isolating them, connecting them rather than leaving a very social organism deprived of the associations essential to their well-being and thus ours. What is needed is consideration of the tree. We have the knowledge, we just need to enable it. In closing, I would like to share the words of Dr. Alex Shigo, the father of modern arboriculture and my personal mentor. Respect trees, Trees have dignity too. Learn about trees and their associates so that you can help make better decisions for their long-term, high-quality survival. Thanks very much for your kind attention. So I will stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thank you very much, Naomi. So now it is time for questions. And if you have any questions to Naomi, you can post them in the chat right now. To give people some time to post their questions, I would also like to pose a question myself. You just mentioned examples of knowledge that you stated that is already existing to accommodate those trees' communal needs that you mentioned. So could you give examples of that knowledge that already exists?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Vera. So there is a list of how best to accommodate. And so this list usually starts with cluster plantings. And cluster plantings have been very successful when used in cities to calm traffic. And they're usually created in a corner where you have streets that are merging, that are busy streets, and you want to slow traffic down. But from the tree perspective, creating a cluster planting allows trees that should work together. And usually when I select trees, I always include information about their mycorrhizal preferences in my list of which trees to put together in a cluster. So these trees that are planted in a cluster are sharing soil volume as they would in a forest, which enables this underground communal network to form and trees to share what they normally share in a forest. In addition, if you measure soil volume comparatively between what we use when we plant trees along curbside or what we use when we plant trees in a cluster, cluster plantings use much less soil volume. But that soil volume can be much better explored and used by a tree to benefit itself and to help with its self-management. If we use linear plantings along the curb, there are strategies such as root trenches, and where we can connect trees that are growing in a linear setup by creating trenches where they can share their roots. Again, not as good as cluster, but providing an opportunity where trees can communicate between each other. These soil trenches and root trenches can also be used to move roots out under pavement to surrounding green spaces where you have a more open landscape that roots can explore. There's also structural substrate that can be used under pavement to again accommodate root growth and allow a conduit effect that you don't have roots growing directly under pavement, but where they belong, so you can move them out into an open landscape.
Yeah, thank you, Naomi.
You're welcome.
I actually would have a follow-up question, but I will keep that for later because now we have several questions in the chat. So one question by Nidhi Chauhan, please forgive my pronunciation, is the practice of high-density plantations is also being recommended these days. What are your thoughts about applying this kind of practice in urban forestry? I think this is very much connected to what we've been talking about, but maybe you want to elaborate on that.
Correct. And of course, urban forestry done the best it can be done always begins with planning and design. And so all of our initiatives that are beneficial to the tree, and if it's beneficial to the tree, it's beneficial to people, is front-loaded. And so when you are planning a development or tree planting or anything, then consideration needs to be given to the tree in terms of soil volume and what roots need in order to grow. And my understanding of high density plantations, when you are in the middle of a city and you are dealing with city streets in urban life, the competition for the underground is very intense because of all of the utilities that cities need to support in order to support our demands. So one needs to be very creative in how one can accommodate what trees need in this highly competitive usage of underground space. And it is more the use of taking the traditional approach to planting, linear or smaller cluster plantings, and creating an environment in which trees can have their roots, which are opportunistic, explore soil, that the soil that is used is explorable, and we provide mechanisms to connect trees. Because in many cities, you don't have the space to provide high density plantations outside of cluster plantings or open landscape where you have more of a park-like situation where you can accommodate denser plantation. So I hope, Nidhi, this answers your question.
Hey, thank you. And then I would go on to the next question that has been posted by Daniel. And he's been asking what number of different trees and open surface in square meters is a good minimum to form a functional community?
So there's many correlations that have been created between soil volume and accommodating tree growth. But as I mentioned with cluster plantings, and these are published, and it's driven by which tree are you planting? How large is the tree? What is the expected mature size of the tree in an urban area, not in a forest? Because trees adaptive capacity in an urban area is different than trees' adaptive capability in a forest. If you plant a Platanus X hybrida in an open landscape in a park, you have branch development that you would never see in a forest. And the same is true for the rest of the closed canopy trees like quercus and fagus. And so there's formulas that have been created to determine soil volume in relation to anticipated canopy. I don't have them all in my head. There are charts that I refer to depending on what species I am planting. But the idea is to create more cluster type plantings where you don't need as much soil volume as you do in a linear environment, and you can still afford trees a better communal situation where roots can be exploring the soil volume that is shared by the entire cluster. So
Thank you, Naomi. Then We have another question posted by Clive Davies. Thank you for your question, Clive. And it is asking you about your thoughts on the importance of the soil microbiome that lives beneath urban trees.
So, morning, Clive. But this, of course, is critical. And it's, if you remember, Vera, in yesterday's conversation about what we're doing here in Lucerne to try to restore health to this Tilia platyphyllos. All of our trees that we use in cities are forest trees, and they are used to living in a living soil. And a living soil means this microbial and invertebrate community. And that is essential to the functioning of soil. And allowing trees to grow in a soil that is not living, how are roots going to access what they need to provide to the entire tree organism if there's nothing in the soil that accommodates and creates soil function? I mean, it is the microbial and invertebrate community that takes the organic layer, processes it in an environment that has oxygen and water, and that results in roots' ability to access water-based nutrients. And if this entire process doesn't exist, you can't expect a tree to grow, especially into maturity. So the soil microbiome is a critical element in actually growing an urban tree and growing the urban forest, and indirectly our own well-being.
Yeah, I see Clive typing another question or maybe a follow-up answer on this, but I would like to use the opportunity to also ask a question that connects to that soil microbiome, because I was thinking about if you want to allow a higher soil infiltration in a city where most of the surfaces are closed. So I would like to ask you, as an urban forester in Switzerland, have you made experiences with alternative surfaces coming up that are being promoted to allow a little bit more of infiltration to the soil?
Well, it's something that I promote routinely in my practice. I'm currently involved in a continuing education program teaching urban forestry, and I did a whole presentation on alternative paving surfaces. And of course, we understand we have to accommodate pedestrians. That's a given. So how do we do that and at the same time better accommodate trees? So one method is dry set pavers, where you are not mortaring them in. You have space between the pavers, and in that space you can get a buildup of organic material, and you have the ability to exchange oxygen, and it enhances water infiltration. So that's another mechanism. In addition, when a tree is functioning the way it should function, and that means the roots are functioning the way they should function, you have a really good turnover in fine root recycling, so renewal. So fine roots live and they die, and they live and they die, and they live and they die. This adds organic matter to the soil. And in order for that organic matter to be processed, there needs to be the soil microbiome, that living part of the soil. And that is essential. In order to have that, you need oxygen and water.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think this answers my question quite well. So I see there's several options that you're promoting for that. And there's another question now by Clive, who's hinting at the example of Melbourne about projects that give trees a digital identity. So what do you think about these kind of projects? Are we robbing them of their agency value and turning them potentially into a digital reality only?
So I would wonder if accompanying this program, if there is any element in the urban forest management strategy that shares our knowledge of trees with citizens. I don't know that we can stop this digitalization of everything, but in order to compensate for that or balance that out, we as professionals need to be more willing to share what we know with citizens, to create programs that are culturally sensitive and intuitive to bring people into this world of urban forest ecosystem so that there is a better relationship to everything we depend on for our existence and what we need to do to support that. And I would say that climate change presents a sterling opportunity to explore that better, because I hear from citizens over and over again the what can I do question. And it behooves the professional to come out of our little world of only connecting with each other and move out into the community and find ways to culturally and relevantly share what we know and help citizens join us in stewarding this urban forest ecosystem. And that will help balance out this digital reality. And do I like the digital reality? No. Do I feel people should go in the forest? Do I feel people should do what Alex Shigo always told people to do? Touch trees, learn about trees, connect to trees? Yes. But the digital reality is there. And I think we as professionals can mitigate that by how we work with citizens.
Thank you. Another question has been posted by Daniel right now, and he's asking, how would you say soil life can be protected from road salt and other toxins?
Daniel, a really good question. So, we have all kinds of criteria about how we select urban trees. And we, of course, if a tree is near a busy road and the way roads are managed is to use road salt, we try to select trees that can tolerate this form of salt. But the soil is often not thought about in how this buildup in the soil affects the soil microbiome. And one of the ways in which to mitigate the impact of soil is to always maintain a composted wood chip layer so that the salt is not directly intruding. And if a community is involved with a watering strategy so that in droughty conditions you don't allow soil to dry out, then it is the infiltration of water combined with this organic layer that can help process salt through the soil and eliminate it from a buildup in the soil, which would kill the microbiome.
Okay, thanks, Naomi. I see that there's Nidhi now, who elaborated a little bit more on the question that has been posted before regarding the high density plantation practices. And Nidhi stated that he was referring to practices like the Miyawaki techniques, and said that although they are all the rage these days, considering today's topics, Nidhi feels, wouldn't it be considered a kind of isolation as well, since this structure is certainly affected in such practice? So, Nidhi, if you want to, I can see that you're muted at the moment, but if you would like to elaborate more on your question, you can also feel free to unmute yourself. Hey, Nidhi.
Hello, ma'am. I was actually, I think that these techniques are being used a lot these days, especially in Asia, and these techniques generally, they're very easy to apply, and they give results in a short amount of time, and the amount of result is also good. So everybody is recommending these techniques, but I have felt that since we are clustering, this is too much, making the structure too much dense in this plantation. Wouldn't it affect the structure of the small forest that we are creating as well? And shouldn't it be considered isolation as well?
Yeah, I also know about Miyawaki, and I have spoken at length with a community in Lebanon that is using this strategy to green areas that are extended open land. And I, like you, have reservations about the strategy. If you've gone into a number of forests, and I'm not talking about plantation forests, but forests that are more self-managing, forever wild forests, you never see the kind of densification that you do in a Miyawaki planting. And I'm wondering why the practice of Miyawaki is demanding such densification. And the other thing that I asked but never got an answer is if the mycorrhiza species is a consideration in the selection of what goes into this high density plantation, so that it's not just ignoring whether they are ecto or endo mycorrhiza related, but that you are using that as a strategy with which to select what you actually put into this plantation. And I think this has not been in the ground long enough to really have a thorough evaluation of how successful the technique is. Think about what we do in the urban forest. You plant trees, and they might live for 20 years, but they usually, under most situations, they're not living beyond the 20 to 40-year range. Well, Miyawaki has not been happening long enough for us to really evaluate the success of this plantation. So I think the jury is out, but I agree with your reservations.
Yes, ma'am. I have also studied a lot about this, and most of the studies that have been given out for now are only regarding how much production we get after the results are out. Only carbon stocking and these things are studied, but we do not study about the soil structure that has changed during that time. And considering that the topic today is philosophical question also, it should be studies as well.
Yes. Well, often soil is ignored in what we study, and we see that in our urban areas, that it's forgotten that it is the basis for terrestrial life, and so hopefully the studies will increase and include soil. And again, we have to wait to see whether or not these practices really work. Thank you for your thoughts.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you both. And I would like to go on with the next question by Daniel, who's asking about giving architects, developers, and urban public a gross idea of dedicated surface for functional clusters versus individual trees. What dedicated open surface dimensions are we talking about? And he's adding that leaving necessary shared root space and dependence on the types of plants to the next deeper level of discussion.
So I can't give you an exact of X amount of soil to X tree. This part of the difficulty with the way we approach planning and development is oftentimes the person who is the tree expert is not part of that. And as I mentioned before, there are published charts that show relational volume of soil to the tree that you are planting, or trees that you are planting, in terms of species and expected crown width. And in relation to crown width, one can then extrapolate root development. But included in all of this is what is the surrounding area? What is the land use? What is the surface treatment that is expected? What kind of utilities are present in this area or planned to be installed? There are many considerations that go into formulating how and where you put the tree, what kind of soil. Are you able to give it normal soil? Are you more forced into a structural substrate to accommodate because of the paving that is required for the area? Because the pedestrian element can never be forgotten. So in the planning of this and the design for what will be, there needs to be the person who is tree savvy in order to ensure that there is an accommodation in an appropriate way of the trees that will be planted.
Yeah, thank you, Naomi, and also thank you, Daniel, for your question. I see you're typing, but I would like to now also address the question posted by Clive. What are your thoughts on using trees in novel urban ecosystems, such as on rooftops or on balconies, such as Bosco Verticale?
So I am not a fan of Bosco Verticale. I believe, rather emphatically, the trees belong in the ground with an adequate, accessible volume of open living soil. Vega sylvatica does not belong on a balcony in a container. There's also another element about buildings such as Bosco Verticale. And that is that the tendency is that this is not a residence that can be afforded by the common person. If one delves into the engineering elements that need to be incorporated into the building of such buildings, this increases the maintenance, it increases the cost of building the structure, because the minute you incorporate green material, you have to consider how you are going to irrigate. And irrigation always challenges the waterproofing elements needed to ensure that you do not have water moving inside the structure. All of this takes money, and money usually translates into how much it costs to either buy the apartment or rent the apartment. Trees belong with people, and I'm not opposed to greening rooftops with appropriate plant material that the roof and its structural integrity can support. But if you ask an arborist what they think about putting trees on walls or on roofs, the answer is usually, I'll never walk by that building for fear of a branch falling down on my head. And so, can trees successfully, over the long term, retain their own structural integrity? In these kinds of environments we are now asking them to exist in. And I'm concerned that they cannot. And so I'm more inclined to want to put a tree where you have people and you can have this exchange of people and the environment that trees create. So I hope that answers your question, Clive.
Okay, thank you both, Clive and Naomi, for answering the questions. And I see that there's still people typing questions into the chat. We can still wait another moment. Maybe also coming back to the question posted by Clive previously about the project in Melbourne. Do you know of similar projects happening in Switzerland where arborists are working together with people to communicate about the ecosystem services provided by urban trees?
Well, urban forestry as a profession doesn't really exist in Switzerland. We're only just starting the process of teaching it now. So, yeah, ecosystem services outside of carbon storage and sequestration is really a newer thinking. Methodologies that can quantify those services, it's only just since 2 years that iTree is here. And all the other quantifying methodologies really focus on just carbon, whereas iTree the emphasis is not just on carbon, but much more on leaf surface area, because that's where the tree excels. When it comes to carbon, it's really soil. And in order for soil to effectively store carbon, you need a living soil. And for trees excel at all the rest of it, air pollution mitigation and particulate contamination reduction and avoided runoff. It's those services that really bring the crown into the picture. And so that's only the first time it's being really quantified in Switzerland is with the current iTree project that's been running since 2018. And in 2017, we did a pilot where we actually set up Switzerland in the iTree database.
Also, Daniel was elaborating a little bit more on the question he posed before. So I think he's trying to get more precise numbers, some kind of numbers. So when discussing, for example, with neighbors, other planners or developers, in a moment where specialists with specific expertise are not always present and you don't really have the time to look up any kind of chart. So he's asking, are you talking more about 10, 20, 50 square meters?
So I can do it really in inches. So if you have a tree, for example, that has a 34-foot canopy spread, you need 1,000 cubic feet of soil. So that would be in metric, then it would be 300 cubic feet of soil with a canopy spread of 10 meters, and that's a minimum. So I hope that helps.
Okay, he's asking, how do the established charts apply for functional clusters with shared root space?
I'm sorry, Vera, can you say that again?
Yeah, sure. How do the established charts apply for functional clusters with shared root space?
They don't.
Okay, clear answer.
Right. I don't know of any chart that deals with cluster. And so normally what you do is you look at your minimum soil volumes per tree and you try to configure this within the footprint that you have to work with for the cluster in terms of how much soil volume can you fit into this designated cluster area. And once you have that measurement, you calculate how many trees that can accommodate with a slight reduction in soil volume. Using the measurements that exist. But nobody's done a cluster that I know of.
Okay, thank you very much, Naomi. I think with that, we have 1 minute left for our session, so I would like to use that 1 minute and ask you to give the last word to you if you want to give one takeaway message of today's discussion and the philosophical thoughts that we have been sharing.
Well, I think that anyone that works with trees needs to do what Alex Shigo always used to suggest, and that is go in a forest. Observe how trees are growing in a forest, and remembering that all the trees that we use in the city are forest trees. Bring those observations out into the city in terms of how we not just plant trees, but how we grow them. And the idea, the other thing that's being pushed is canopy. And why do you have to plant 20 trees? Why not grow what you have into maturity and get your canopy that way? And now think about what it will take to grow that tree into maturity, both above ground and below ground.
Okay, thank you very much, Naomi, and thank you also to all the participants for engaging in the discussion. And with that, I would like to close today's session. And
thanks very much, Vera.
Yeah, thank you very much, and hint also to tomorrow's afternoon event about green spaces and urban densification. So if you would like to see more on that, I'm just pasting a link into the chat. And thank you very much to all.
Thanks very much, everyone.